The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Pinnacle Building's executive conference room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table, where I had made countless decisions over the past 28 years. Outside, Nashville's skyline stretched toward the Cumberland River, the city's famous music venues and honky-tonk bars preparing for another night of dreams and heartbreak, while inside this sterile corporate environment, I was preparing for my own professional finale. My name is Charles Chuck Henderson, and at 62 I was attending my own forced retirement party, though the company preferred to call it a transition celebration. The room buzzed with the nervous energy of colleagues who weren't quite sure how to act around someone who had been systematically pushed out of the organization he had helped build from a regional insurance agency into a Fortune 500 financial services powerhouse. I sat at the head of the table, a position of honor that felt more like a defendant's chair, watching executives half my age make small talk and check their phones while picking at catered sandwiches and store-bought cake. The same executives who, just 3 years ago, would have hung on my every word when I shared insights from nearly 3 decades of building client relationships and navigating market crises. The irony wasn't lost on me. The client retention strategies that had made Henderson Financial Services a household name in the Southeast were methodologies I had developed through years of understanding that insurance wasn't about policies and premiums. It was about being there for families during their darkest moments. Every innovation, every breakthrough approach, every industry award we'd won could be traced back to lessons I'd learned by actually caring about the people we served. The end had begun 18 months ago when the board hired Derek Walsh as Chief Executive Officer. At 37, Derek embodied everything modern corporate America seemed to worship. Harvard MBA, previous experience disrupting 3 different industries, and the kind of algorithmic thinking that reduced human relationships to data points and conversion metrics. I had tried to work with Derek, really tried. When he arrived with plans to revolutionize our customer engagement paradigm and leverage technology to optimize operational efficiency, I supported his digital transformation initiatives. When he suggested implementing AI-driven customer service protocols, I helped train the systems despite knowing that no algorithm could replace the human intuition needed to guide families through tragedy and loss. But it quickly became clear that Derek's vision of the future didn't include room for someone like me. In strategy meetings, he would dismiss my contributions as legacy thinking and emotional decision-making. When I shared stories about clients whose lives we'd changed through personalized service, he would interrupt with comments about scalability and data-driven outcomes. The systematic marginalization was methodical and brutal. Client relationships I had nurtured for decades were transferred to relationship managers who had never met these families, but could access their entire history through CRM dashboards. Strategic decisions I had made based on market experience were overruled by algorithms that analyzed patterns but couldn't understand context. The final insult had come 6 months ago when Derek announced my transition to emeritus status, corporate speak for forced retirement disguised as honor. The press release praised my foundational contributions during the company's formative years, while making it clear that Henderson Financial Services was ready to embrace a future unencumbered by outdated approaches. Today's farewell gathering was supposed to be a celebration of my legacy, but I could see in Derek's eyes that it was really a public demonstration of what happened to executives who couldn't adapt to his vision of modern business. He wanted to control the narrative, to ensure that my departure was seen as a natural transition rather than the purge it actually was. What Derek didn't know was that I had no intention of going quietly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced, standing at the head of the conference table with the kind of practiced smile that had probably been perfected in MBA presentation classes. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate Chuck Henderson's remarkable career with our organization." The applause that followed was polite but perfunctory, the kind of recognition typically reserved for retiring security guards or long-serving administrative assistants. Around the table I could see faces that had once sought my guidance, now looking anywhere but directly at me. "Chuck has been with Henderson Financial Services for 28 years, Derek continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone reading from a carefully prepared script, representing a traditional approach to client services that served its purpose during a different era in our industry. The words hit like carefully aimed arrows. Traditional, different era. The past tense was unmistakable, the message clear. I was a relic being politely retired. During Chuck's tenure, Derek said, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. Our company grew from a small regional agency to a significant player in the Southeast market. His personal approach to client relationships reflected the values of a simpler time in financial services. I felt my jaw clench as Derek reduced 28 years of innovation and client advocacy to quaint nostalgia. The simpler time, he referenced, had included navigating 3 major economic downturns, helping thousands of families through disasters and tragedies, and building the reputation for integrity that had made our company a trusted name across 5 states. As we move forward, Derek continued, his voice gaining the momentum of someone delivering an inevitable verdict. Henderson Financial Services is embracing the future of our industry. Data-driven decision-making, scalable solutions, and the kind of technological innovation that today's consumers expect. He paused, looking directly at me with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was delivering a masterclass in corporate transition management. So let's give Chuck a warm send-off, Derek concluded, and then hear a few brief words from the man himself before we discuss the exciting developments ahead for our organization. Brief words. The limitation was clear, the expectation obvious. Say thank you, sit down, and disappear into corporate history. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 28 years pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Around the table, colleagues who had once competed for my attention now checked their phones and watches, clearly eager to move past this uncomfortable formality and get back to their real work. Thank you, Derek, I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions building in my chest. I appreciate this opportunity to share a few thoughts. Derek's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He had expected gratitude, perhaps a few nostalgic anecdotes, and then a graceful exit that would allow him to pivot to his vision of the company's bright future. 28 years, I continued, looking around the room at faces that had grown familiar over decades of shared challenges and victories. It's interesting how time changes perspective. When I started here, we measured success differently. I could see Derek shifting in his seat, his expression beginning to show concern as he realized this might not go according to his script. We measured success by the widow who didn't lose her home because we processed her life insurance claim in 2 days instead of 2 weeks. We measured it by the young family whose medical bills were covered without question when their child was diagnosed with cancer. We measured it by the small business owner who could rebuild after a fire because we understood that his livelihood wasn't just about property. It was about his employees' families, his community's economic stability. The room was growing quieter, phones being set aside as people began to pay attention to something that sounded different from the usual corporate farewell platitudes. But I suppose, I said, my voice taking on an edge that surprised even me, that kind of thinking represents a simpler time in our industry. Derek's face was beginning to redden, his carefully orchestrated transition ceremony slipping from his control. Chuck, perhaps we should... Actually, Derek, I interrupted, my voice growing stronger with each word. I think there are a few things that need to be said. Things about what this company used to stand for, and what it's becoming. Derek stood up abruptly, his polite facade cracking like ice under pressure. Chuck, I think we've heard enough reminiscing. Perhaps it's time to... Time to what? I asked, my voice cutting through his attempt to regain control. Time to pretend that 28 years of building relationships and serving families can be reduced to a few nostalgic anecdotes? The room fell silent. 25 executives suddenly aware that they were witnessing something unscripted and potentially explosive. Derek's carefully orchestrated farewell was becoming something he hadn't planned for. The truth. The fact is, I continued, my voice rising with 3 decades of suppressed frustration, this company has lost its way. We used to be in the business of helping people. Now we're in the business of optimizing algorithms and maximizing quarterly metrics. Derek's face was flushed now, his authority being challenged in front of his entire leadership team. Chuck, this is neither the time nor the place for what? For honesty? I turned to address the entire room, seeing faces that reflected a mixture of discomfort, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. When did we decide that caring about our clients was legacy thinking? When did we conclude that understanding human nature was less valuable than analyzing data patterns? That's enough, Derek said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. This celebration is about honoring your contributions, not airing grievances about business decisions you don't understand. The condescension in his voice was the final straw. Don't understand? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Derek, I built the client relationships that generate 60% of this company's revenue. I developed the service protocols that earned us every industry award we've won in the past decade. I created the reputation for integrity that you're now systematically destroying in the name of efficiency. Derek moved toward me, clearly intending to end this confrontation. Chuck, you're embarrassing yourself. Security will escort you out if necessary. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Around the table, I could see colleagues looking down at their hands, unable to meet my eyes as they witnessed my professional execution. That's when a voice from the back of the room cut through the tension like a blade. Let him speak the truth. The voice belonged to Margaret Torres, our director of claims processing, a woman in her 40s who had worked her way up from an entry-level position through sheer competence and dedication. She stood near the back of the room, her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from watching injustice unfold in real time. "Margaret," Derek said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "this is inappropriate. Please sit down." "What's inappropriate?" Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger. "Is watching you silence the man who taught most of us everything we know about actually serving clients." The room erupted in murmurs as other employees began to shift in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others looking nervously between Derek and Margaret. The carefully controlled corporate environment was beginning to crack under the pressure of suppressed truth. "Chuck Henderson didn't just work here for 28 years, Margaret continued, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had finally decided to speak up. He built the foundation that everything else stands on. The client service protocols that Derek just dismissed as legacy thinking, they're the reason we have a 94% client retention rate." Derek's face was now completely red, his authority crumbling in front of his entire leadership team. "Margaret, you're out of line. Return to your seat immediately." But Margaret wasn't alone anymore. Tom Bradley, our senior underwriter, stood up from his chair near the middle of the table. "She's right, Derek. Chuck's outdated approaches saved this company during the 2008 financial crisis. While other firms were collapsing because they'd forgotten how to actually serve people, we thrived because Chuck had built relationships based on trust, not just transactions." More voices began to join in. Sarah Kim, our regional sales manager, stood and added, "The client families that Derek wants to manage through algorithms, they don't want to talk to a chatbot when their husband dies or their house burns down. They want to talk to someone who understands that insurance isn't about policies. It's about being there when people's worlds fall apart." Derek was frantically looking around the room, trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "This is highly unprofessional. I will not tolerate insubordination." "Insubordination?" The voice came from James Wright, our longest-serving agent, who had been with the company almost as long as I had. "Derek, what you're witnessing isn't insubordination. It's loyalty. Loyalty to the man who taught us that this business is about more than profit margins and efficiency metrics." James stood up, his weathered face serious with the weight of decades of experience. "You want to know the truth about Chuck Henderson? He's the reason half the people in this room chose to work in insurance instead of just selling it. He showed us that we could make a difference in people's lives, that we could be there for families during their worst moments and help them rebuild." The room was now filled with standing employees, their faces reflecting a mixture of respect, defiance, and something that looked like relief at finally being able to speak the truth. "So yes," James concluded, his voice carrying across the silent room, "let him speak the truth, because someone needs to say what we've all been thinking but we're too afraid to voice." Derek stood alone at the head of the table, his carefully orchestrated farewell transformed into a public referendum on his leadership. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Derek looked around the room at his leadership team, people he had hired, promoted, and trusted to implement his vision, and saw something he clearly hadn't expected: unified opposition to his attempt to silence me. I stood there, overwhelmed by the support of colleagues who had risked their own positions to defend not just me, but the principles that had made Henderson Financial Services more than just another insurance company. "The truth," I said, my voice carrying across the now silent room, "is that this company succeeded not because we were efficient, but because we cared. Not because we had the best algorithms, but because we had the biggest hearts. Not because we optimized processes, but because we optimized hope." I looked directly at Derek, seeing in his eyes the beginning of understanding, or perhaps just the recognition that his corporate revolution had hit an unexpected wall of human loyalty. You can call my methods outdated, Derek. You can dismiss relationship building as inefficient. You can replace personal service with artificial intelligence. But you can't replace the trust that comes from knowing that when life falls apart, there's someone who genuinely cares about putting it back together. The applause that erupted was thunderous, sustained, and transformative. Not the polite recognition Derek had orchestrated, but something deeper. A celebration of values that transcended corporate politics and quarterly reports. 6 months later, I received a call from the board of directors. Derek Walsh had decided to pursue other opportunities, and they were asking if I would consider returning as chief executive officer to help the company rediscover its founding principles. I accepted, but with one condition. Margaret Torres would be my chief operating officer. As I sat in my new office, looking out at the Nashville skyline, I realized that sometimes the most important speeches aren't the ones you plan to give, but the ones you're forced to fight for the right to deliver. And sometimes the greatest honor isn't being celebrated by those in power, but being defended by those who understand that some truths are worth the risk of speaking. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched someone be silenced for speaking inconvenient truths, please share this video. Sometimes the most powerful moments in our careers come not from planned presentations, but from the courage to speak truth to power when it matters most. Subscribe for more stories that remind us that real leadership isn't about controlling the narrative. It's about having the courage to let the truth be heard. Remember, behind every outdated approach is often a foundation of values that the next generation desperately needs to preserve. Your voice matters. Your experience has value. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be silenced.